folks. You're listening to the Jobs Podcast. I am your host, Tim Hendricks. Your time is valuable. I'm not going to waste it. Let's get right to the interview. Hey, good morning, Patti. How are you doing today?
Thanks, Tim. Thanks for having me.
You bet. I'm excited to talk with you today because you're a genealogist, and that's what we're talking about today. And I do not have much knowledge on that subject. So let's go ahead and get right to it. Give me a little bit of history tell me your genealogy, basically, where you were born, siblings, family members, that kind of a thing.
I was actually born in California. I was a first generation Californian. I'm 66, almost 67 now. So that'll tell you about what time period that is.
Mm-hmm.
But both my parents had moved. My dad had moved from Pennsylvania with his family. And then after he and my mom got married in Tennessee, in Memphis or near Memphis, he ended up back in California. And then, of course, my mom's parents followed and stuff. So I grew up in California, but I don't have a long history there. On the other hand, my grandfather, my mom's dad, was born in Missouri and had a very long line of Missouri genealogy, which has been really great. And I just feel like Missouri is my home because of that. Anyway, so I was born in California. I wanted to be a stay-at-home mom and homeschool my kids, and we felt like that we could not do that kind of thing in the Bay Area. I went to Humboldt State University, which is in far northern California. It's more rural, and it is also less expensive to live. But mainly, we'd gone up there to go to college, and I got my bachelor's degree in biology. And then we had kids and stuff. We were there for 10 years. And in 1990, we moved to Missouri and have been here. So it's been, over 34 years now that we've been here, longer than I ever lived in California. So I like that. I like that. I feel like this is a home state for me.
Yeah.
So my parents divorced actually when I was 3, and we grew up with my grandparents. I didn't hear a lot of family stories, but I did hear a few things. I just have one sister, one full sister. My dad and remarried and had 2 kids with his second wife, my dad came here and lived with us the last few months of his life. So my parents came from very different genealogical backgrounds, with my dad coming from Pennsylvania and my mom being born in Tennessee and her dad in Missouri. And that has been very fun for me because it means that I have a lot of exposure and experience in researching in many different places. And I feel like has been a real benefit to me. So as I say, we moved here in 90. I continued to homeschool my kids. And then in about 1999, I got interested in genealogy and could only do it part-time because of my other responsibilities. And then about 2007 or 8, when things were freeing up for me a little bit with my kids growing up, and I was able to spend more time with it, I started doing educational events. There are institutes and conferences that you can attend as a genealogist, and I started doing those things. Fortunately, my dad had left a little bit of money, and I decided I would use my inheritance to learn about my heritage. So that enabled me to do that, where the funds maybe wouldn't have been there. And I completely understand people who feel they don't have the monetary assets to be able to do things like that. You can learn on your own. So It's not that you have to, and there's plenty of free things out on the internet and inexpensive things out there on the internet to learn more. So then in 2009, the library, the Springfield Greene County Library District, contacted me about a part-time position in their local history and genealogy department. And they knew that I had done a lot of these educational things and was an experienced genealogist by that time. So I worked there for about, 6 years or something, and I really enjoyed that. And then as time went on, I was asked to do more teaching and presenting, and I was getting more client work. And so I quit the library, and I've been doing that type of thing ever since. I do have some writings, things that I've written that have been published that I'm proud of. So anyway, so
Yeah.
that's that. I guess I don't mean to take over your podcast here,
No, that's why
Chris.
I'm just a guide. You're the expert, so please talk as much
Okay.
as you want.
Well, I think one of the things that I really I look back on in my childhood and my high school and college years, and I do see how there were things that directed me down the path that I've gone, and those were part of the questions that you gave to me. And one of them was I always loved detective stories and historical fiction. Those were my two favorite
Okay.
types of books to read.
Right.
And I was a reader from the time, I mean, I don't even remember learning to read. Nobody else in my family read. Nobody else read books. I really was the only one. And I just feel like that it sort of saved me. You know, it saved me
Hmm.
from being isolated in the way I thought life was. It broadened my horizons. It gave me exposure to history. And I love, as I say, I like the detective kind of thing. I love problem solving.
Okay.
And I think that the problem solving that you use in genealogy, that, those detective novels and things like that, like, of course, when you're young, it's like Nancy Drew, the Hardy Boys,
Right.
and
I
stuff.
read those.
Yeah, yeah, and Agatha Christie, and
Yeah.
and so and then when I was in high school, I was exposed to a really, really good chemistry teacher, and this is just goes to the importance of how those people in educational positions can really be an influence on people. And he was such a good teacher, and I loved chemistry. And I took total of 5 years of science in high school, and but there's sort of a corollary to the detective thing, in that science is you want to learn how things work, how they operate, what makes this happen, and that kind of thing. And that's what drew me to it, and that's why I decided to major in biology in college. So and of course, so that leads up, the reason I emphasize that is that I am a specialist in the genealogy world, in that I have a specialty in DNA analysis,
Okay.
and its use in genealogy. So, and so I never would have suspected that those kinds of things would have been important to me later. Also, in college, my last semester of college history, I had a wonderful, wonderful teacher, and who had us read books rather than textbooks memorizing facts, dates and places and battles and all this
Right.
kind of stuff. And these books were more about cause and effect. So you learned that this event happened, and then the ramifications of those events caused this to happen, and that kind of thing, and that fascinated me. And I learned that history was more about people and decisions and things like that, rather than just names and dates and places.
Right.
So I just, I unfortunately, that was my last history class in college, but it did lead me down a path of reading a lot of history. So I moved from doing historical fiction to reading actual history books, so and so the I feel that genealogy is the natural dovetailing of the detective type skills
Hmm.
combined with history, and it really does help in genealogy to have a good broad historical background knowledge.
Right. One question I had about something as you were speaking, you talked about the job that you had at the library in Springfield. And did you just come into a room that was just full of boxes and documents and you had to start somewhere and or can you walk me through how does that start? Like, what is the day like of a person in that line of
Oh,
work?
well, for the most part, and what I was hired for was as a reference associate. So
Okay.
my main job was helping the patrons with their
Okay.
genealogy. So the local history and genealogy department has a lot of published books. they don't have so much documents. I mean, some libraries do have
Hmm.
documents,
Okay.
and even some counties have transferred documents to public libraries. But for the most part, their documents are donated materials, which can be important and helpful. But they aren't like the regular documents that we a lot of times we use in genealogy. But I mean, the Library Center does have some. So, one important set of records, they have two actually. One are the Frisco employee records that they have original documents of. And
Hmm.
then the other are the Turnbow manuscripts. And the Turnbow manuscript, Silas Turnbow was a man who interviewed a lot of people in the Ozarks and wrote down their stories. And and he lived in the latter part of the 1800s, and so there were people alive whose parents and grandparents they knew and knew things that had happened with them. And so that's an important resource too. So I'm not saying that there aren't any. It's just usually documents and things are in archives. So we have the
Okay.
Greene County Archives, which and the Springfield History Museum, and those places have records of the government records, which are the most important in genealogy. The government records are.
Right.
So, which I can explain, but I won't go into now unless you
Well,
want to know.
well, you've mentioned a couple of times, and I've picked up on it. You really have a passion for reading mystery novels and whodunit type stuff, detective things. Um, have you ever been requested to work with law enforcement or someone on a case that where your expertise in DNA or genealogy or whatever would play a part?
I haven't. I mean, I have once. I did work on a case with the FBI once, but it turned out that my work was moot at that point because a very large DNA match came in that helped them to identify the killer right
Ah,
away. And so I have not, other than that one, I have not been involved with that at all. I wouldn't mind doing that because certainly, especially for Jane Doe's,
yeah.
Jane and John Doe's, it's a really important thing and stuff. I have done a lot of work with adoptees and people otherwise with unknown parentage. Like sometimes people don't know who the father is. They know who
Sure.
their mother is, but not the father. So, and that can be back, two or three or four generations and stuff. So I've done quite a few of those.
That was one of the questions I had is that who are your typical clients or people that come to you looking for assistance? And I wondered about people that have been adopted.
Yeah. So there
Does that
are
happen very often?
sort of two categories of people.
Hmm.
A lot of times, there are the, amateur genealogist who gets stuck and they want a professional to try to solve a problem. And
Okay.
then there are these other, and those don't have necessarily have anything to do with DNA. And then of course there are the closer relatives, unknown parentage cases. That do that. I'm actually trying to cut back on my client work,
Mm.
so because I want to focus my efforts in other places. So it I think it all depends a lot on what people what people do as far as what their areas of expertise. But yes, for me, it's been more the client work has been that. I also get paid for teaching and things like that. Although teaching doesn't really pay, so it doesn't really recompense you for the time you spend preparing. So.
Right. Yeah, there's a lot of work that goes into teaching. They're definitely underpaid. Do you do or in the past have you done a lot of teaching at different universities or
No, universities don't generally have an outlet for this kind of thing. There are a couple, like there's Brigham Young University in Utah that has a genealogy program, and I think there is. Most of my I teach at institutes, and
okay.
those are week-long courses, and there are three major institutes in the US. And so I coordinate a course on using DNA with genetics in it's for the Institute of Genealogy and Historical Research, IGHR. And so I do that, and then I do. conferences. I did 2 presentations in York County, South Carolina last month, and then I'm doing a couple of things in the spring and early summer this next year. So
Hmm.
again, I'm trying to limit some of that,
Right.
just because I'm busy all the time and don't seem to
Right.
have time to do everything I want to do.
You mentioned a minute ago about was it the Mormons and their record keeping?
Yes.
One of the other interviews that I did was with a college friend of mine. He does cancer research. He's a doctor, and he had said that oftentimes in their research for disease history, they would turn to the LDS community because of their extensive record keeping. Do you ever deal with them in that line of work as far as disease or any kind of a?
No, not generally.
Okay.
They're one of the DNA companies, DNA direct to consumer DNA testing companies is 23andMe, and they focus on health issues.
Oh, okay.
So there is that, but genealogists use it also. And if you're working on the genealogy of an LDS person, then certainly the records of the LDS church are valuable, and
Hmm.
that is because they have, it's a spiritual thing for them. I'm not LDS, so I'm not speaking from that, but it's a spiritual
Right.
thing for them to baptize their ancestors into the
Hmm.
church, or maybe they call it sealing, not baptizing. Maybe it's the same thing. I don't know,
Yeah.
but they do that. So genealogy has always been important to them. So they have a lot of things documented for their families. The other thing that they have a website, familysearch.org, and the genealogy can be very all over the place as far as the quality of it. A lot of times the genealogy outside of the like records that LDS members have through the whatever the 150 years, 180 years that they've been around, those of course would be really good for the LDS families, but the genealogy of other people and their trees are not always very good, and they're not well documented. And so a lot of times you might look at those just for a hint or a clue, but the most valuable thing that they have done is to go into courthouses and archives and uh, digitize image the records, the original records. And
Okay.
so they make those used to just be on microfilm. So
Hmm.
you had to either order microfilm or go to Salt Lake City to look at the film. And now everything is digitized. Now it's not all available. Some of it they have contracts with these different entities, and sometimes they say yes, it's fine to let the public access them, and sometimes it's not. So those are really having those original records on their website that are digitized and accessible, not necessarily indexed. And that's the thing. There's kind of that other aspect to genealogy that I hope we get into, but they're not. A lot of the records are not digitally indexed, so you can't just put a name into a search box. You have to know how to use the internal indexes for the records themselves.
Okay.
And that's kind of what makes them it makes them a little bit more challenging to use. And yet, on the other hand, my contention is that it makes you a better researcher if you understand and know how to do that.
Well, that makes sense. And you just said there's something you wanted to get into. Let's do it. Dive right
Okay.
in.
Okay. One of the things that I think we're seeing more of is that people get on ancestry.com, and you can find all kinds of things on Ancestry. And of course, like even just compared to 5 years ago and 10 years ago, there's so much more available.
Yeah.
And so a lot of times people they think that they're doing like genealogist work because they can build a tree. They can find somebody else's tree that already has their ancestors in it, and they can add on to their tree. Ancestry makes that super easy. You documents. A lot of times people have found documents, and I would say a lot of times when people have found these, it's because some really good researcher originally found them.
Uh,
And then of course people are piggybacking on that. So I sort of have this love-hate relationship with Ancestry, in that,
mhm.
they charge, and it certainly is worthwhile to me for the subscription cost. But for some people, it's a lot. And really, what they're doing is they're leveraging the research that other people have done, that their
Oh, okay.
members have done.
Right.
And so it is quite often. Now, I have to say that I feel like, as long as you understand the limitations of what you're doing, and that you may not really know how to research, if that's all you're doing, if all
Yeah.
you're doing is plugging a name into databases, and you're finding records that pop up, and you're finding relatives that pop up, and you're not going about it in some sort of methodical fashion, um, and certainly electronic indexes can be used that way. Well, you're not really doing research, and as long as you understand that and realize that you may be limited when it comes down the line to where, oh, now I don't know what to do. Like, nobody has this parent in their tree, and I have no
Right.
idea what to do. And the other thing is being able to recognize that something isn't right, or that there's no evidence for it.
Mm.
So, there are people that are connected in trees, and I know that I've extensively researched that family, and there's absolutely nothing in any of those records that indicate that relationship. Then I'm suspect, I'm
Right.
suspicious of that. And you
Mhm.
don't know to be suspicious of that unless you've done the real research yourselves. And I call
Hmm.
it kind of like boots on the ground,
Yeah.
which used to mean that you needed to go to a courthouse and things. And now, because a lot of those courthouse records are digitized, you can look at them on Family Search. And the other thing is a lot of people don't realize that some of the more recent additions to Ancestry are actually coming from Family Search. Family Search has allowed Ancestry to use the digitized images in exchange for Ancestry's employees, indexing them.
Mm.
And then they have a proprietary use of that index for a certain length of time, and then after that, that index you can use it on Family Search also. So you can
Mm.
almost always find more on Family Search if you know how to research than you do on Ancestry.
Is it difficult to learn how to research if you wanted to use that family website, or is it something that really only, I mean, you got to do it for a long time like yourself to be able to use that effectively?
Well, it does come with practice, but
Okay.
actually, I'm a very active member of Ozarks Genealogical Society, and I am teaching 2 sessions on using Family Search in the upcoming months.
Okay.
So our programs are the first Monday evening of the month and the third Wednesday morning of the month. So we have two programs a month, and I can't tell you the dates offhand. I have my web browser shut down as instructed. so and
Thank
so
you.
uh, but it's ozarksgs.org is our website, and then you can see the events in the right hand side. And so I'm doing 2 presentations on using Family Search Part 1, Family Search Part 2. But there is also, like, just learning how to use the records. And as I mentioned earlier, a lot of our ancestors may have been illiterate. They didn't leave diaries and letters that are hanging around places,
Right.
but they were required by law to submit certain paperwork. So if they wanted to get a pension for serving in the Civil War, they had to submit paperwork. Somebody else may have written it for them, or if they wanted to buy a piece of land, they had to execute a deed, or buy the original land from the federal government. So certain aspects of things we can almost always find, or tax. People were taxed, and so we can find tax lists to find our ancestors in certain areas. And a lot of times those are the records that are not indexed, electronically indexed. So the most fundamental records that genealogists should use, what I would call the meat and potatoes of genealogy, are probate records, land records, court records, and tax records. And so and there are books, of course, to teach you about that. There's one book by Christine Rose that's called Courthouse Research. There's another book by Val Greenwood that's called something with American genealogy in it, in the title. And those are two of, books that explain those types of records and how they're indexed and things. And that is how I learned originally, because I didn't take any classes for a few years, but I had a really good head start because I read books, which of course I think, is, a lot of people just don't read books anymore.
Right.
And, it's a shame because you learn things in much greater depth than you
Yeah.
do in superficial sound bites of things. So I would hope that if the podcast does nothing else, that it'll get people to doing that type of thing.
I will say, I know people that read pretty regularly, and what you'll notice about a conversation with someone who's an avid reader is that their vocabulary is much wider than just their
Yes.
everyday
Mm-hmm.
folks. Um,
Absolutely.
they can communicate more effectively. I'm not a huge book reader as far as sitting down and reading a long book cover to cover, but I read articles constantly, because I'm just jumping around on topics all the time. But I do like to read.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I guess my attention span might be that of a gnat, so it goes from one subject matter to another. But
Yeah, well, and of course, this is getting off topic a little bit, but
yeah,
the more you practice that, the easier it gets.
right,
So, and
right,
if that's something that you want to do, then and I understand having time limitations. You probably have a family as well
yeah,
as trying to keep up with topics for the
hmm,
podcast and things. But if you can, decide I'm going to read this long book, and just set your mind to it, given whatever time constraints that you have. But and I
we
agree with you. So when I was a kid, because I was a voracious reader, people would actually, other kids made fun of me for my
right.
vocabulary, and I sort of dumbed my language down for a little while, and then after a while, I just thought, I'm just not going to do that anymore. So
Well, think of what they were making fun of you for being intelligent and communicating effectively, and that makes no sense at all. So
yeah, yeah.
the
Anyway.
website that you mentioned a little bit ago, what was family? I forgot the whole web address.
FamilySearch.org is the
Okay,
LDS is the
okay.
LDS site. Yeah.
All right. See, I remember a number of years ago, my mother-in-law, for I think it was a Christmas present, got myself and my brother-in-law one of those ancestry.com things where you take some saliva and send it off to them, and then you get an
Oh
email,
yeah.
a few weeks later.
Hmm.
And I'd never done anything like that before, other than just hearing what my parents and grandparents said their relatives were from. And the ancestry, I don't know if it's even effective at a bird's eye view of your genealogy, and then you have to take it from there and dive deep. It basically just said I was aggressively white, like Scotland and
Yeah.
Ireland and
Right.
Germanic, and um, I'm like a sheet of paper without the lines, kind of white. So I don't know if that's now accurate. You kind of have me questioning whether that's even close to realistic, or if I need to go down a different rabbit hole to see where I'm actually from lineage wise.
Okay, well, actually, that's a great question, and is something that is really common for people, especially those who aren't genealogists, to not really know what those DNA results are telling them and what value they can receive from them.
Okay.
And of course, a lot of people are interested in those, what they're really technically called biogeographical estimates. And so those are something that is the least accurate part of DNA testing. But they've gotten better. They've gotten better over the years. And as more people test and they have more representation from a
Hmm.
broader population base, they become more accurate. And
Okay.
so, and certainly it is sort of a broad brush kind of thing. There are, it involves statistics and how much of certain stretches of your DNA that you have is comparable to which population group. And sometimes it's like, okay, well, it's more like this one than like this one, so we're going to plug you into this category, which makes it, a little bit iffy. So just sort of as an example, my aunt, I'm 1/8 Swedish. My aunt is 1/4 Swedish. And I show no Swedish ancestry at all. And my sister does, and my aunt does. My aunt shows, what would be expected, 25%. So, but it's changed. I used to have some, and now it's gone. And because they adjust them, You don't have to do any further testing. They just go through and reapply the algorithms that have been updated to the tests that are already in their database, and then you get new results. So you can log in and see how it's changed, or how it might be different. But that is the least accurate part. The main reason for using DNA, and the most accurate part, is how much you match other people. So they compare your chromosomes with the chromosomes of everybody else in the database, and they find matching segments of DNA on those chromosomes, and those, then they total them up. They total up the amount, in what are called centimorgans. It's sort of like feet or inches, a length of DNA,
Okay.
and they total those up. And the closer the relationship, the more DNA that you will share with someone. So your closer relatives, will share hundreds of centimorgans of DNA, whereas more distant relatives may only share 10 or 20 or 30 centimorgans. So the thing that we do, especially with unknown or adoptee cases, is you're looking at all of those large matches. Then you're doing what the most important tool is called shared matches. And when you do shared matches, all of those people that are shared matches with you and the selected match are likely related all in the same way. And when you look at the trees of those people, which is why it's important to have a family tree on Ancestry, then what you see is, what do they have in common? What family do they have in common? And that is likely the way that the adoptee or person with unknown parentage is related. So
Hmm.
it this does apply for more distant ancestry too, but it's much more difficult to figure out. So you can use, and that's actually what I like to do. And one of the reasons why I'm limiting my client research is because I want to work more on my own things. And so I want to be able to break down brick walls by looking at the DNA and discovering a distant ancestor using those same kinds of techniques. So, and when I say have a tree on Ancestry, you don't have to have a full blown, like, do all your genealogy there. But if you just put out like 4 generations, and not even that much, it's even helpful just to have it out to your grandparents, if that's all you know. And then somebody who's knowledgeable will know how to take your tree when they're a match to you and they look at your tree. They'll know how to build that tree out to try to figure out how you're related to them. The more you have, the better it is. But I don't put a lot of information in my tree on Ancestry. I have it in a database, a separate database, and it's not in one of the online database providers. So I call it a skeletal tree. So just my ancestors, but I do give names and dates and places. So the names, dates, and places are super important. You can see that you have a John Smith who lives in New York in 1830, and knowing the date and the place can help you differentiate John Smith, who lives in South Carolina, who was born about 1809. So, those kinds of things, those are identifiers. They help you to specifically identify that ancestor. So
What
those,
you what you
go
just
ahead.
mentioned there, like the John Smith, I can see the waters getting pretty muddy when you're talking about things, what a last name that thousands and thousands of people had, like Smith or Johnson or something along those lines. How do you deviate between, well, this John Smith was over here and this John Smith was over here, and so they go down different paths? I can see that being difficult to, or maybe
Yes.
tedious is a better word to use.
Yeah, it's always nice if you have somebody with kind of an unusual name, but
Right.
the thing is that you want to uniquely identify a person, and there are, the vital records go into that. Let me back up a little bit first. If you work from you. Sort of a bedrock principle of genealogical research is to work from the known to the unknown. So you never try to jump back. Like if you heard, oh, I'm related to Abraham Lincoln. Well, you don't jump back trying to find the connection. What you do is you work on your genealogy step by step and methodically, and you'll run into it if you are. So, but the thing is that the later records give you clues to earlier locations and things. So you look at somebody in the 1850 census and he's X amount of years old and it says he was born in this state. And then okay, well, I need to, and you also are doing that research, that meat and potatoes research that I was talking about earlier with land and with probate and with land and with court and with tax records. And those are the kinds of things, using those things. So, for example, there was a man, I'm trying to think of what the name was. There were two groups of same name people in a county I want to say it was in the Carolinas, where he distinguished between the two of them because of where they lived using land records. So, this John Smith lived in this area of the county, and this John Smith lived in that area of the county. And that's why it's super important to know how to do research in those types of records.
Right. You may have answered this question a little bit ago as I was listening to you talk. I was thinking in my head, I wonder how far back you have to realistically go before, if someone comes to you and says, well, I only know back to my great grandparents, is that typically enough to get a running start or?
Yes, yes.
Okay. All right.
Yeah. Yeah, that's actually you could do it earlier. I mean, grandparents and of course so funny story at the library. One of the there was a young girl who came in and wanted help, and I asked her um, who her grandparents were to help get her started. And her grandparents were still living, and at usually where you get a really good start in genealogy is by looking at the last census available. And so I think at that time it was probably 1930, and her grandmother hadn't wasn't born by 1930, so her
Mm-hmm.
grandparents weren't in the 1930 census. So I said, okay, well, you're going to need to go talk to, and it turned out that she was the niece of a friend of mine. And so I
Huh.
said, and so I knew she could talk to her grandparents. So I said, you need to go talk to your grandma and
Mm-hmm.
go and find out who her parents were. And then I can help you. So a lot of times it's just really hard with more recent stuff. Now it's a little bit easier now than it was back then, because I would say that was probably about 2009, 10, just when I was starting at the library. But the now we have a lot of online newspapers,
Oh,
and a
sure.
lot of them, they end at 1923 because that's the copyright date, where they can put anything on. But you can pay, like on newspapers.com, you can pay an extra subscription price to get more recent newspapers. And so a lot of times that's especially helpful with adoptee and unknown parentage cases, because you're trying to find these relationships that you can't find in records because they're still in a time where they're trying to keep them private. Like usually you can't get, only family can get death certificates for deaths occurring in the last 50 years. And, so there are limitations on some of the records that you can get. And then of course, sometimes you have to know where to find them to even be able to get them. So, it's, it newspapers have made that a lot easier to be able to find some of those things, but typically you need to have somebody that is in, and now their censuses are released 72 years later. So we have the 1950 census, which we got 2 years ago. And then of course in 2032, the 1960 census will be released. So, but you see, I was born in the 1950s, and so I'm not in any of the censuses that are
Hmm.
available yet.
I didn't
So,
realize
but
they released them like that. I thought it was just, you could just get it after a few years. So,
no, no, it's
hmm.
privatized for 72 years.
Hmm.
So
Interesting.
anyway, so it's really helpful if you can get started if you have a name and an approximate age and a location, and to be able to find somebody in the 1950 or 19 better 40 census. mainly because the 1950 didn't ask as many questions as the 1940 and 30 did. So you have a little bit more information on those censuses. But
Hmm. This is really interesting. Do you have any knowledge? I'm sure you do. If someone wanted to get into this field, but they're wondering where they could apply that to a specific career, I can see some use in disease research or the health field. I can see some in working for a county office or something along those lines. But what types of occupations would use your work as the bulk of their day? Do you have any
yeah.
suggestions on that?
Well, there. I would say the people that I know who have the most work in a particular given field, maybe fall into these categories. And one are people who are called forensic genealogists, and they research for for estates, and do heir research.
Oh,
And
yeah.
so they work for attorneys, and they make court appearances and things like that. I've never done that, but
Hmm.
I know several people who do. And then uh, there are libraries. Generally, courthouses and government facilities do not have people who are experienced with genealogy.
Okay.
If you want to run across one, it's wonderful.
Hmm.
If and a lot of times they're interested when you go in and you research in a courthouse and you tell them what you're looking for. A lot of times the staff will be interested.
Sure.
So it's but like there's a man that works over in Cape Girardeau who's a genealogist, and then John Dugan, who is the Missouri State Archivist up at Jefferson City.
Hmm.
He is also a genealogist, and he formerly had been in Memphis, Tennessee before he became the Missouri State Archivist. And so I had actually met him before when I was in Memphis. That's where my mom's family was for 30 years or so
Right.
after they had come from Missouri. But his mother was a title researcher, and so he got dragged along to courthouses to do research in land records. And so anyway, so he's so it is a great resource when you have people in those positions who really are genealogists and have that background. So I would say archives are a good place,
Yeah.
and historical societies. I would say probably the problem with those are that they are not as well paying as I mean, they may not pay very well.
Yeah.
The I bet the forensic stuff probably makes the most amount of money as far as that. There are
Hmm.
also people who do repatriation, which is where they do genealogy on military men who are lost, and their remains might possibly be found.
Oh, sure.
And so then when they find remains, they're able to do this. So what what the repatriation genealogists do, is they search for family members. They don't seek them out. I mean, they don't contact them. They do the research and finding family members, and then they submit that to the government, and then the government, then if they find remains that match with someone, then, or I'm sorry, if they suspect, then they will go to these people. Well, I'm not sure how it goes. Maybe they go to these people and ask them to test first, so that their DNA is in the database as a basis of comparison. So I'm not sure of the process of what happens later, whether they go ahead and try to but the genealogist doesn't contact the family at all. They're just
Right.
doing the genealogy work. So I know quite a few people who do that. And so then the other way is if you work as a staff genealogist somewhere like the DAR or the DUV or the War of 1812, these lineage societies. When people submit their lineage applications, then they're evaluated by these staff genealogists. So
The first two examples you gave, the one with inheritance or heirs and making sure that someone is of the lineage. I can see that being, uh, if you're usually dealing with an awful lot of money or a large inheritance if someone is going to
Yes.
go to that trouble. So that's
And
certainly
you're
a
dealing
niche.
and you're dealing with the legal system and lawyers.
Oh yeah, yeah, fun. That sounds fun.
Oh, well, I'm just saying that, that
Yeah,
we always think of that as garnering a lot of money, but
yeah,
anyway.
yeah, yeah. And then the I'm thinking POWs and MIAs, that whole thing that you were talking about there. Finding, you've never dealt with any of that as far as with the government from Vietnam, for example, or something along those
No.
lines? Okay,
No, but I know, I know several people who do that.
sure.
And part of it is that the people, uh, individual genealogists will contract with the government to perform a certain number of cases over the course of a year. And so
Okay,
then they hire genealogists to work under them. And those people usually have to be like certified genealogists. They have to have a credential like that. And so the other credential that might work is an AG, and so AG or CG, and then but the people under them, as long as they're being, CG is overseeing it, then they have people that are not CGs working with them.
a
So
CG would be a certified genealogist.
genealogist,
Okay,
right,
all right.
right.
Sorry, I interrupted you. You were saying?
No, no. So no, um, I'm just saying there is that work. It's just that to be sort of the top person in that pyramid or hierarchy, there aren't as many of those as there are of the people who work under them. So so and I think their work is evaluated. I'm sure it is. It's evaluated by them. So I would say that most of the other people just do freelance, like I do, freelance genealogy. And of course, the problem with it is that it's sort of a rich man's, um, you know, poor people can't afford to pay a genealogist normally.
Sure. Right.
So, and my husband is a welder,
Uh
and he
huh.
has his own welding business, and you can always use a welder, no matter whether the times are good or whether they're bad. If they're
Right.
good, you're building new stuff. If they're bad, you're repairing old stuff.
Right.
And genealogy isn't like that. It's like so that's why, and a lot of times people, and I understand, like, because we were poor at one time, I understand the fact that, like, oh, you want to hire a genealogist, but you just can't. But that's what forces you to learn to do it better and more yourself,
Yeah.
So
Well, the internet probably helps quite a bit if you know where to look and where to do the research. It's a lot
yeah.
better than having to go look at microfilm in a library somewhere.
Yes,
So,
yes, that's right, that's right.
these next two questions, I'm curious about your answer. I think it may be difficult for you to answer because the first one is, what do you like most about your job? But it seems like you love everything about your job.
Well, I have to no. There are some downsides, but yeah, I do. I love doing the genealogy and such, and so the research, of course, is what I like. The downside to doing research for hire is that a lot of times, you have to accommodate for report writing. You have to write up a good report that documents everything you did. And a lot of times clients don't understand the amount of time that it takes. You may spend, like, if you're going to do 10 hours, and, like, my minimum for adoptees and unknown parentage cases is 10 hours. But usually, if it's a difficult research problem, my minimum is 20 hours. But I had a client a couple of years ago that it was hundreds, like about 400 hours.
Good grief.
So, but she understood that. She knew that going in, that it would
Okay.
be that. And so, but generally speaking, people just don't realize, especially when they're trying to solve some unknown ancestor, back 5, 6, 7 generations that they haven't been able to figure out themselves, They just don't realize, they should realize if they know they haven't been able to find it, but they think, oh, I'm going to get this expert. And yes, the expert is more efficient. The expert knows where to look, which records to look at, what's important, what's not important, things like that. The expert knows that. And so the research is more efficient. It's just that it still takes a lot of time. So I would say that the frustrating part for me is a lot of times not getting to a point where you have a good resolution. So,
I hadn't thought about the report writing of that. Is a typical report, are we talking 10, 15, 20 pages long or?
yeah, I would say that I'm trying to think of, you know, I I would say for a short research project, it might only be 10 to 20 pages.
Okay.
And, but for something that is more extensive, the person that I did the hundreds of hours of research for, I was actually entering stuff into a database, and then I was writing because she wanted it published. So I was writing the narrative version that was going to be submitted for publication.
Hmm. Do you have people that come to you and say, I'm pretty sure I'm related to King Henry? Can you make that happen? Is that kind of people looking for fame or an
Yeah,
inheritance, I guess?
right. And and I don't know whether, I used to be willing when I didn't have very much client research to take almost anything, but I probably
Hmm.
wouldn't take something like that. And just because it doesn't interest me. And there are specialists in those royal line kind of things, and a lot of times the royal lines have been researched by other people and then descendant lines have been published. So, for example, the Mayflower. I mean, I don't consider the Mayflower to be quite the same thing, but
Right.
you as Henry, um, but the the Mayflower Society has published a lot of descendant lineages. So you find, you can find your ancestor in one of those, and then it gives you the lineage back to that Mayflower ancestor. So a lot of times there's a lot known already about the famous people, and a lot of times it's doing that connecting from what you know, and that's where I say you just work your way back in your genealogy to do that. And so, like, if I knew that somebody wanted to, oh, I helped somebody with that. I forgot. There was somebody who wanted to, who felt like that she was descended from this particular Mayflower ancestor, and I was going to Pennsylvania, and so I did research in a couple of counties where her ancestors lived, and I was able to find the evidence to connect to make that link. So a lot of times that people have problems with, and this comes into play with patriot ancestors, with the DAR, the Daughters of American Revolution, is that a lot of times that patriot and you might even know his children, but then your ancestry comes tantalizingly close to it, but you can't quite make that connection. And a lot of times there's a generation that's kind of right in the middle. Right in the middle, maybe closer, farther back, because of migration. And a lot of times those patriot ancestors who lived in the colonies, their ancestors migrated west, and they ended up in these places where the connection to that patriot family is not so obvious, and so quite often there's a generation where there's a gap that it takes a little bit more work, or it may even be impossible. There may not be any evidence for the relationship.
Hmm. As you've been doing this for a number of years now, I think on the surface, it's pretty obvious when you see what has changed in your industry as far as now everything or most things are on computers or you can access more on computers. But have you seen any big seismic shifts in this industry, I guess, for lack of a better word, that has made your job easier or better or more frustrating?
Well, so I definitely wouldn't say most. There's definitely more, but not most online.
Okay.
But the DNA is one. That's a total game changer. From, when I was first doing genealogy, there was no DNA testing. Why DNA testing? testing the Y chromosome of males was the starting point, and that was about in 2004 or so.
Oh,
And
okay.
then they started testing the autosomal DNA chromosomes in about 2012. And so things have really just taken off from there. And there have been a lot of tools to help genealogists use DNA and to get more out of their DNA test results. So, and I'll give another plug for I am actually doing and I don't know how widespread your audience is, because this is only helpful if you're local. Well, not. We do it on Zoom too. But Ozarks Genealogical Society on April 16th, I'm going to be doing like a presentation on what to do, how to work with your ancestry DNA test results. So
Okay.
it'll be sort of a beginner type orientation to using your test results. Normally we meet at the library center, but because of like a room got reserved by somebody else, we're actually having it at Boulevard Baptist Church,
Okay.
which may be familiar to you.
Hmm.
So,
It
uh,
is.
and so yeah, Boulevard has graciously allowed us to have that meeting. So it's April 16th at 10 in the morning, and people can, it's free to the public. If you want to join by Zoom, you have to become a member to get the Zoom link. But
Okay.
so I will be doing that introduction to ancestry DNA for that. So that was another game changer. And then we have all these other tools that have become available to make it easier to use them. And then the more recent thing is something I mentioned earlier before we were recording, which is artificial intelligence. And
Oh, yeah.
Family Search has been a leader in this, where you can do full text searching on handwritten documents that are land and probate records on there, so they don't have to be indexed by someone, and you can find people in unexpected places. So there is that. There's AI has opened up this for that, and then it transcribes the documents. Of course, they always have to be double checked. One of the things I saw in one that I was doing the other night was that it was a 2-page. It was showing the portion of the either left hand or right hand page of the book of land records, and it was including a transcription of what was in the left hand page on the same line with the right hand page. So there's lots of problems with it still, but it certainly can make things very quick and easy. The other thing it does is you can ask it to do a summary of what was there. And then of course there's the other artificial intelligence tools like Chat GPT and Claude and other things that genealogists are using to make sort of compiling research information. I'm trying to think of what there's two guys who do a podcast on using artificial intelligence with genealogy. Mark Thompson and Steve Little are their names, and it's something like artificial intelligence for genealogists or something like that, and it's a podcast. And so they keep you up to date on things that you can do with AI and genealogy. So of course, and it's a burgeoning field, so there's lots of new information always coming out and things like that. But I have actually copied and pasted what has been transcribed. You can upload documents into those interfaces, and it will transcribe them for you. It will also summarize them for you or extract particular information that you want from them. So, for example, Mark Thompson on that podcast, he talks about one of the prompts that he uses extracts he takes an obituary from a newspaper and says, and tells the interface to extract the names and the relationships, and it does that.
Good grief.
So I mean, it's only as good as what's in the original, of course,
Right.
but
Right.
and stuff. So anyway, so yeah, I would say that the DNA and the AI have been real game changers and have made things easier. So one of the things that I think about with using all the advantages that we have. Like, I just think back of all the hard work I had to find some things that are now easily found, indexed, like on Ancestry and things like that.
Right.
And and it's just that I like people to know that there's more to it underneath the surface than just doing that, and you will understand what you're seeing better. But those tools, like genealogists before the early 2000s, when they started putting censuses online, um, before that, and I would say like no, not Heritage Quest. That was the name of the database that had census images online, and then Ancestry, of course. But the thing about it is that before that, people had to actually order microfilm. So you could go to your local library. So the Springfield Greene County Library, it had all this Missouri microfilm for censuses, but it didn't have censuses for other locations. So if you wanted to find your ancestor in an Indiana location, well, you had to order that microfilm and have it, sent in like through interlibrary loan or something. So it actually, I think, came from the National Archives. But, and some libraries have more. So Midwest Genealogy Center up in Independence, they had a lot more of those kinds of things. But the thing is that what that does is it frees us up to spend more time on analyzing what we're seeing, so that we'll, hopefully put more thought into what is the background context for these records. What do I see by looking at the records before and the records after, and what patterns are there? And there's lots of factors too, and who are the people that they're associated with and stuff. So I I found a land record in Pittsylvania County, Virginia, that had a line at the very end of the deed that it was a sale by siblings. Their brother had died, and so they inherited his land, and so they were selling the land. Well, one of the siblings was not included, and they put her name down at the bottom of that deed. So if anybody had looked for her in the index, they wouldn't have found her, because she wasn't one of the internal indexes that I was talking about before. So by looking through that, I found her. And then when I tracked her to where she had moved from Virginia to North Carolina, there was a deed that she and her husband executed that had as a witness one of her uncles. And so then I knew what happened to the uncle. I had no idea what happened to that uncle. And so, so there are just things like that. You've got to really pay attention to the details and, have some way of recording those details so that you can better analyze them and correlate them. So analysis and correlation is a big part of the genealogy standards. So that's, being a certified genealogist means that you work to the standards that have been developed, and those they're published in a book called Genealogy Standards, but they are the work of people who over decades and decades of work have sort of formulated methodologies and things that make for good practices for genealogy.
You know,
So analysis and correlation are two of those are part of that.
you didn't know it, but you were just answering one of the questions that I always I'm sure to ask when I speak of someone is what type of skills, personalities or soft skills that someone would benefit from getting into the line of work of whoever I'm speaking with. And you're talking about the detail orientation and the natural curiosity to just keep digging and paying attention. Those are standing out to me as two key factors in someone's skill set or personality that would make them enjoy this line of work.
Yes, absolutely. That's
Are there
true.
any other ones that you would add to that list?
Um, some things just grow on you. So
Yeah.
one of the things that, I've never considered myself to be much of a writer. I always felt that I could be a good technical writer. My vocabulary is good and my syntax is good, and grammatically I speak correctly.
Hmm.
But as far as writing in a way that is not being overly verbose, that was one of my problems to begin with. And so, and also, people like to have sentences that are more direct and shorter. I'm not sure I agree with that theory, because so many of the great writers of the past didn't do that.
Right.
So, but the thing that I think that has happened is and this is something that I sort of came into, is that when I'm writing up a narrative about a family, there is so much that you get out of it that until you actually experience that, you don't realize. And part of it is the synthesis. You start putting things together that you write, and you see things that you didn't see before, and you also notice holes, like, oh, how do I know that? And I better figure out, why I think that, and if there's any documentation for that. And so it has been like, I just coming to an end product of something written like that has been so rewarding for me. And it's really hard work. Like, writing is hard work for many people. Some people just sit down and they just want to write all the time, and they write.
Hmm.
When you're having to do this kind of writing, you have to be really careful that you're not saying anything that you don't know, from that you can't document. And
Yeah.
so that makes it a little bit harder. And but I feel like that the rewards are great, and that's why. So I became a certified genealogist in 2014, and then I just a few months ago became a certified genetic genealogist. And I've had things published in the National Genealogical Society Quarterly. I've had 2 articles published in there, and I've been published in the New York Record. And I wrote a chapter for a book called Advanced Genetic Genealogy, and it was a case study of how I identified my great great grandmother, whose name was totally unknown to me. No first
Mm,
name, no last name.
really?
And using DNA, and then using documentary evidence of closeness of your relationship, families moving together in the same places, and that kind of thing. So so those have been really rewarding to me to be able to do. So I think that probably depending on what your ultimate goal is in doing genealogy, I think sometimes, like, the report writing is onerous and hard, onerous and hard. I'm being redundant, but
Mm, yeah.
it's hard, and stuff. But you can take a great deal of pride of having produced something, and I think that's one thing that's sort of lacking in our society as a whole, that everybody is expecting that things will be easy, and they don't realize that you get so much enjoyment and satisfaction from attacking something that is difficult and challenging, and creating a product from it that is like the carrot at the end of the stick that that leads me on. So that's why I'm trying to I want to do less client research, because I want to, and teaching. I've also cut back on my teaching because I want to research and write more. Because, and I have a couple of people that I know who they have prioritized that in their lives, and um, they're sort of my, the people I look to as, like, that's what I want to do. I want to do
Right.
what they're doing. So.
You mentioned a minute ago about you got certifications. What were the 2 categories that you got certified in? One of them was in 2009, I believe, and then
No,
one was
2014 is
okay.
when I became a certified genealogist,
Okay.
and that's with the board for certification of genealogists. So it's I think, oh, I should know this, bcgcertification.org. And then and it's the same entity that does the genetic genealogy. It's actually a new credential.
Okay.
So there are some law enforcement, there are some agencies that are requiring, if you're doing a case that has legal ramifications to it,
Yeah.
that it be done by a certified, just like my husband is a certified welder, and there are some
Okay.
jobs that he does that you have to be certified to do it. So so there are some cases where they are requiring that you have some sort of certification. And so the board for certification of genealogists developed this new credential, certification of genetic genealogist, and I think I'm number 5 or 4, maybe I'm 4, for, we only have, I think we have six now. We have six certified genetic genealogists, but so
Wow.
I think I was four. Yeah. So
Is that online training, or do you have to submit a certain number of case studies or examples of
yeah.
your
So
work, or
yeah.
both?
So yeah. So the two main sort of accrediting or certifying bodies are BCG, the Board for Certification of Genealogists, and what you do is you submit uh, work products, and there are different aspects of what you submit. And those are to demonstrate skills in different areas.
Okay.
Like one thing is like transcribing, abstracting, analysis, and research recommendation. One is doing research for another person so that you demonstrate that you can actually jump into research for somebody else and not just your own family. And then one is where you solve a complex evidence case where there's certain criteria that define it as a complex evidence case. And then a KDP, which is kinship determination, where you do 3 generations of a family and you write 2 proof arguments or summaries to within that to do that. There's sort of a hierarchy of what you need to do as far as developing proof for relationships. Sometimes relationships are very easy to prove, and then sometimes they're more difficult and require a more complex solution to demonstrating that. So,
How long does
so
that
there's that.
how long does that process typically take? Is that kind of at your own pace, or it usually
Yes,
takes
yeah.
about a year? Okay.
No, so you can they actually give you a year to once you submit a preliminary application, they give you a year to complete it, to submit
Okay.
it. But you actually don't you could do the preliminary application and turn around the next day and submit. And so the and that's actually what I mean, I recommend that people practice a lot. Some people want to become certified because they want to be able to say, hey, I'm a certified genealogist and be able to get more clients. But they're not ready because they haven't done enough research. And
Right.
that's where practicing, you just really need to practice. And then also, you know, research for other people, practicing that research for other people. So the other accrediting body, I don't want to leave that one out, is the ICAP Gen, and they give an AG credential, which is accredited genealogist, and that's sort of based out of Utah. And what they do is more of a demonstration of regional expertise. Certified genealogists are people who know the research skills and the methodologies to apply to good quality research, whereas the AG, I mean, I'm sure it emphasizes good quality research too, but its emphasis is more on regional expertise. So
Okay.
you apply to become accredited in a certain region of the world or of the country,
Okay.
and stuff. And
Well,
they do have a testing component. They have
that is
one
a
part that's
question. That is a question, though. You just mentioned something that I didn't even think to ask. Is most of your work done in the United States, or do you do global, or is it a mix of anything and everything?
well, I've done the only areas that I really have expertise in outside of the US um, are England and Sweden.
Okay.
And actually my expertise is not as good in those two locations. So I did have a client, a local man that I did some research for, and one of his ancestors did come from England, and I was able to find, the marriage record and the birth record and things like that in England. So I am certainly aware of the most common resources for English research, but not as much for other countries. And some countries, like Ireland, is horrible. Uh, it's horrible in that if your ancestors came from Ireland before about I've forgotten what the date is, before about 1850, there's like almost no records because all the records were lost. All the, census, most of the censuses and vital records and things like that. So if there are church records that are still left, then, and there's probably some other things, but it's very, very difficult to do some
Hmm.
of those countries like that. So anyway.
If you I'll shift gears here for a second because I'm really curious about this next question. If you didn't end up doing the line of work that you're in now, was there another occupation or area of work that you always thought, I wouldn't mind doing that. Maybe I should have done that, or not necessarily regret, but just wondering if you would have excelled in something else.
Well, because of my, I did have something else that I thought I wanted to do. When I was a kid, I thought I wanted to be a nurse, and then I
Hmm.
decided I didn't want to be a nurse. But then with I did, so my husband was a biology major also. That's how we met. And
Okay.
he knows a lot about animals and plants and, all this kind of
Hmm.
stuff. And I don't. I mean, it's like it's kind of in one ear and out the other as far as, but what I really liked were all the functional, physiological, chemical, and to see like principles of physics that apply to chemistry and principles of chemistry that apply to biology.
Hmm.
And those things were and basically because I did really well in chemistry, the chemistry classes, that I took in my biology, I actually thought that I wanted to be a lab technician. So I wanted to work in a laboratory, like a hospital laboratory or something. So
Right.
anyway, so yeah, there was that.
Have you ever, I'm thinking about the folks that have come to you that were adopted. Have you ever had anyone that came to you and when you found something, it was just like the best thing, the best bit of news that they've ever gotten as they were trying to find their mom that, they never did know or something along those lines, where it really was satisfying for you as the researcher to give them something that just kind of completed them as a person?
Yeah, that's an interesting way to look at it. I would say that the part that is like more or less satisfying usually to me is how the relatives react, how the
Oh,
newfound relatives react. And so sometimes it's bad and sometimes it's good.
right.
And so that's part of it. There's one man that I helped where he I've forgotten, but he's in contact with many members of the family who have been very welcoming to him, and they've basically told him that it's better off that his mother doesn't want to have anything to do with him. And so there's that aspect where his mother doesn't want to have anything to do with him, but then he's got these other relatives that do.
Right.
So, and sometimes it just takes people time. There was a someone, this is like just genealogists have a good memory generally. I would say that that's something else that is very helpful in genealogy if you have a good memory for details.
Okay.
Certainly, things should be recorded and written down somewhere, but a lot of times things won't strike you unless you actually remember them. So I had an adopted man, contact me because we matched on GEDmatch, which is one of those third-party tools that I was talking about that has
Okay.
helped us to be able to analyze DNA better. And I looked to see where he matched me. He matched me at the beginning of chromosome 9 and blah, blah, blah. Well, then about 2 weeks later, I was just developing my evidence for the case that was the chapter in that book that was published. And so I had already identified the family. And I mean, I identified the family that I thought it was. I just didn't know maybe exactly who it was, or maybe I was trying to add more evidence. And a man came up and matched me on Ancestry, and so I contacted him and asked if he would move his DNA to GEDmatch. And so he called me up and I talked him through it on the phone, and he transferred his DNA to GEDmatch, and I saw he matched in that same area of chromosome 9.
Hmm.
And then I looked and I saw that he shared a lot of DNA with this adoptee. And then the other thing that I looked at was I saw that he matched on the X chromosome, and males only get X DNA from their mothers. So that meant that this man who matched him on an X chromosome had to be related on his mother's side. And so we were able to figure it out pretty easily. But the mother was didn't it wasn't she was very we don't know what happened. We don't know how she became pregnant with this child. But the relative said that she was very, very shy. And so to me, it seemed more likely that someone took advantage of her.
Right.
And of course she just thought that it would never come out in the open, you know,
Hmm.
nobody else would ever know, which is the kind of shocking things to people who did give up children for adoption. There is a local person here who helps people deal with those kinds of things. But anyway, um, the adoptee was very understanding, and he didn't want to push himself on her and such. And so eventually, though, she showed up as a match to me in my test results, and I contacted him and I said, "Hey, your mom tested." And
Hmm.
to me, and so then he tested with Ancestry. So, see, he hadn't tested with Ancestry. He was on the other databases. He was on Family Tree DNA and on GEDmatch, of course. But so he went ahead and tested on Ancestry, and maybe she wanted confirmation, you know, like, okay,
Yeah.
because as I said earlier, the closer you are related to someone, the more DNA you will share. And so a parent child relationship is very, very obvious with the amount of DNA that's shared. So, you know, these people come around, you know, eventually sometimes. And so I do tell people that, like, you know, they may not be accepting of it right now. Give them time to to deal with it, you know, and then eventually they may. So had another instance of somebody that I was helping, and this wasn't a paid client. This was because it was somebody who was related to me that this person matched on, this person who was an adoptee. And so she asked me for help, like, can you help this guy? And so I figured out who his relative was, and there was a gal who also matched to a large degree. And I just told her, I said, I don't know how to I don't know how you fit in here. You're going to have to find out more about your father's family. Because we knew a lot about her mother, and she knew who her father was, but she hadn't been in contact with him. So uh, and I said, but they should have this surname or that surname. And so she told her mom, and her mom said, "Oh."
Uh-oh.
The man that they thought was her father all this time was not. And
Oh boy.
it was this other guy who was a brother to the adoptee that, you know. And so the other adoptee that I started out helping with. And so the thing is that his relatives didn't want to have, they didn't respond to any messages to, you know, communicate with him, to meet up with him or not. But this gal who had a misidentified father, his family welcomed her with open arms. She
Hmm.
spent Christmas with them. She spent,
Oh my goodness.
you know, and so then the other family, once they found out about this good thing that had happened with them embracing their newfound relatives, they then embraced their newfound half brother. So it did turn out, but it took a long time to come to resolution. So yes, those things are very rewarding, but it's not so much the identifying, although I do take satisfaction from that, as the family responsiveness, you know.
Yeah.
So
Boy, that's an emotional roller coaster that you just took us on.
absolutely,
uh,
absolutely.
that's got to be exciting, though, to see, you know, a conclusion in all of your efforts and all of your research and your work, and then you finally see everything come to fruition. That's got to be satisfying to see a start, a middle, and an end.
Yes, yes, yes.
Patti, this has been, I mean, I didn't really know going into this what we were going to talk about, but I've learned so much. This has been unbelievably fascinating, and I really appreciate you taking the time. It's almost an hour and a half, so I hope it didn't feel like that to me. But my goodness, this
No.
has been
Well,
awesome.
well, I hope I don't bore your listeners, you know, but
No, no,
I, I've enjoyed
no.
it a lot. I enjoy talking about it, I think, as you can tell, and I'm
Yeah,
enthusiastic about
sure,
genealogy
sure.
and all of that. So it was a pleasure and an honor to do this for you. So
It's always nice to talk to somebody who's passionate like you are about their line of work and their career and their interests. So it's contagious. And people, even if they don't know anything about genealogy, like, man, this lady is on it. I need to listen to her. So great job, Patti. Thank you so much.
okay, thank you, Tim. Bye bye.
Bye. And that wraps up another episode of the Jobs Podcast. Thank you so much for joining me today. Hopefully you found that interesting. As always, I wait until the end of an interview to ask you to like, subscribe, and share. I feel it's important that I earn that support from you. Thanks again, and we will see you on the next one.